Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and this week's contract tip has to do with earnest money handling. So when you are when you're negotiating a contract back and forth, you guys know that there is a provision regarding earnest money for the buyer to remit the earnest money. There you have the option, either option A, the first option is the buyer has remitted the funds at the time of writing the offer. The next option is the buyer has X number of days from the binding agreement date to remit the funds to the holder. And the third option is other. The majority of contracts that we see nowadays have that second option where the buyer and the seller negotiate for the buyer's obligation to remit the funds to the holder is a certain number of days after the binding agreement date. And then pre-printed in the contract is already the time frame within which the holder is required to deposit those funds. Deposit those funds, you have a maximum of the number of days specified to deposit those funds. And in the GAR contract, the holder has to deposit those funds within 5 banking days. In the RE forms contract, it is 3 banking days. But that part, the deposit part for the holder, is pre-printed. The buyer and the seller negotiate the buyer's obligation to remit the funds. Then, if there is a provision in the contracts as well, that if the holder does not timely receive, well, it says if the buyer does not timely remit the funds, or if the funds are not honored by the bank, then it is incumbent upon the holder to send notice to the parties, letting them know that the buyer never remitted the funds or they weren't honored by the bank. At that point, the buyer has the obligation to cure that default, and if the buyer does not cure that default, then the seller may terminate. So, in essence, also we know that earnest money, if the buyer defaults on a contract, earnest money may be used as liquidated damages to the seller. So I'm kind of setting the stage for what you need to pay attention to as an agent as a good business practice. So what happens is when buyers and sellers write contracts and agents are handling those contracts, typically, well, I don't know about typically, but it seems that buyers and buyers agents aren't necessarily physically located in the same location at the time they are actually writing the offer. For example, you could show a buyer 5 properties today, you both go home, and then the buyer calls you up later on in the afternoon or in the evening and says, hey Dana, I want to write an offer on 123 Lucky Street that we saw today. So you, the buyer's agent, you write up the contract electronically, you send the buyer a copy of the PDF contract, you call the buyer, you go over it with the buyer. Once the buyer has a thorough understanding of the contract, then you send it to the buyer by e-sign. And then, what do you know as the buyer's agent? What's the listing agent going to want? Yes, the listing agent is going to want a copy of the contract. Now, even in the purchase and sale agreement itself, you put in there buyer to remit funds 3 days after binding agreement date. Nevertheless, you know from practice that the listing agent is more than likely going to want a copy of the earnest money. So you send that off to the buyer to e-sign after you've gone over it with them. And then you say, by the way, this is generally what happens now, by the way, write a check to ABC Realty for whatever the earnest money is, $5,000. Take out your phone, take a picture of that check and email that to me as well. Then you, as the buyer's agent, you email the offer along with a copy of the earnest money check to the listing agent. You negotiate, so forth and so on. I am asking you to consider to not send a copy of the earnest money check unless you have it in your hot little hand. You are setting yourself up for potential issues. Now, you as an agent, it is your responsibility to follow up with the earnest money. Where is it in the remittance process? So if the buyer and the seller negotiate that the buyer doesn't have to remit the funds for 3 days after the binding agreement date, and then depending on how that is going to happen, Are you going to meet the buyer in person and pick up the check? Is the buyer simply going to mail a check to the holder? Do they know to reference your agent name, the property address, so forth and so on? You need to follow up with that. But think about it. What is truly more important than a pretty picture of a check? That doesn't matter, right? What matters is when the holder actually deposits those funds. That is really what is important to both the buyer and the seller. It's definitely important to the seller, number one, because it is considered good faith money. So the seller needs to know that the buyer is in earnest, hence earnest money, about purchasing the property. It's also very important for the buyers because, especially if there is a loan involved, the lender is definitely going to want to see a copy of that earnest money. They're going to want to know it was sent, it was deposited, and the bank did honor that deposit. So it's important on both sides of the deal, but it's especially important if the deal falls apart. So what happens is, and why think about it? Why do we send a picture of the earnest money check? Well, if you've been practicing real estate for, at least here in Georgia, for over 15-ish years, 20-ish years, think back to the contract. Think back to the contract provision regarding earnest money. If you will remember, the only provision for earnest money for you as an agent writing the contract is there wasn't option A, B, C. There was an option for the amount of the earnest money and who the holder was. You had earnest money in your hand when you wrote the offer. You actually had the earnest money in your hand when you wrote the offer. There was no provision, no allowance for a buyer to send it at some later date. And then you all know from license law that as an agent, you are required by license law to turn in those funds to your broker as soon as practically possible after receipt. So back in the day, a copy of the check, an actual scanned copy, PDF copy of the check, in essence, did mean that it was really close to being deposited. Now, it may not have been honored by the bank, but it was at least going to be deposited by the holder because that was the only contractual provision. Well, like many things, we agents continue along with habit without giving any thought to the reason behind why we're doing something. There is no reason to send anybody, a listing agent or a broker, a copy of a check if it is not in your possession, because we don't know where it is in remittance, when or if the buyer is going to remit those funds, and when the holder receives them and is going to deposit them. Also, if the buyer remits the funds, sometimes they'll just put payable to, or put on the envelope, your office address, and it'll be a check in there with their return address, and it'll, in the memo section, it'll just say earnest money. No property referenced, no agent referenced. So the staff at the office gets this check and has no idea where to attribute these funds to, where to make the deposit. Most brokers keep track of their contracts by property address. Or the other thing is the buyer might put your name on the envelope, put it to your office address, it comes in, the staff at the office says, oh, my agent got a letter, and stick it in their agent mailbox. So lots of issues with earnest money handling. Again, it is your responsibility to follow up with where it is. But where this falls into play is the deposit is really the important thing, not the picture of the check. Because if the buyer defaults, then you need to know that the broker has those funds so that the holder of the earnest money can perform their obligation. As we said in the contract, well, I don't know if I said this part yet, but in the contract, the holder of the earnest money is charged with several responsibilities. The first responsibility is to make the deposit within that timely manner. And again, that is spelled out in the contract. 5 banking days in GAR, 3 banking days in the RE forms. Then the contract state that if the buyer doesn't remit the funds or if it's not honored by the bank, the holder is charged with, the holder's responsibility is to send notice to the parties that they don't have the money. And think about it, that totally makes sense. A contract, a purchase and sale agreement with earnest money held by such and such, in essence, is a receipt for that money. So the buyer gets a receipt for that money, but if the holder never actually gets that money, the holder better be sending a notice saying, hey, you might have a receipt, but I never got the money. So the holder is charged with sending a notice. And in the notice, then the buyer has the right to cure, and the holder, if the buyer doesn't cure, then the seller has the right to terminate a contract. So that's two things, the deposit and then the notice. That's two things right off the bat that the holder is responsible for doing. The next issue regarding the earnest money is the disbursement of the earnest money, either at closing, and we're fine with that, or if the contract fails to close, then the holder again is charged with several responsibilities to figure out what to do with that earnest money. So if a contract fails to close and the holder receives a signed release agreement with the buyer and the seller agreeing which party gets the earnest money, then the holder is obligated to disperse those funds to whichever party the parties agree to. In the absence of their agreement, then the holder either has to go through the contract, make an interpretation of what happened, why it failed to close, decide which party they're going to disperse the funds to, then send a notice to both parties with their interpretation and this disbursement notice. And it's referred to as the 10-day notice because then the party not getting the money has 10 days to object. After that point, there's more to that, but that's a different video. There's more to that, but then at that point, then the holder can disperse. Or the other thing is the holder may disperse those funds, may interplead those funds into the registry of a court of competence, a court with jurisdiction over that area. So those are things that the holder is responsible for doing. So consider the following issue. Seller goes binding with a buyer to remit the earnest money funds to the holder 3 days after binding agreement date. Listing agent follows up with buyer's agent and asks for a copy of the earnest money. The buyer's agent sends the listing agent a pretty picture of a check, copy of the earnest money. Never check for a deposit, just a copy of the earnest money that I'm assuming perhaps the buyer's agent got from that scenario. The buyer took a picture and sent it to the listing agent. Anyway, that's the end of the information about the earnest money. There's no notice given that the holder never received it, and so everything's all fine. Get to closing date, buyer fails to close. Buyer doesn't show up at closing and fails to close, definitely defaulting on the contract. So the day after closing, where it failed to close, the listing agent sends a termination and release agreement requesting that the holder, the buyer's agent, send the earnest money to the seller as liquidated damages for the buyer's default. At that point, the buyer's agent says, we never got the earnest money. Problematic. Many problems. Number one, the holder was never notified that they never received the money. Number two, the seller missed out on the opportunity potentially to terminate this contract and go with another contract. And let's face it, what kind of a market are we in right now? We're in a seller's market. So even if we weren't in a seller's market, that seller was tied up for over 30 days with that buyer, and there's no money. The buyer never turned in those funds for the seller to have as liquidated damages. The seller would have loved to have defaulted on 8 days after the binding agreement date if the buyer was not able to perform, so that the seller wasn't tied up and could go on with another contract. So what happens? Who does the seller ever get the earnest money? What happens? Well, again, that contract, in essence, is a receipt for those funds. And the fact that the holder never gave notice to the parties that they didn't have the funds, potentially, I think the holder is obligated to make good on those funds because they never gave the proper notice, and they never said they didn't have them. The buyer and client did default, and the seller contractually is entitled to those funds as liquidated damages. Additionally, the seller is extremely mad because the seller has now tied up a property for 30 days when the seller potentially could have had the right to terminate the contract probably 3 weeks or a week or so into the contract. So what's going to happen in that hypothetical situation? We'll have to wait and see. But lesson to you as an agent. What you need is not a copy of a check, not a copy of a pretty picture, even if it's certified funds. What you all need to check on and what you need to contractually contract for is proof of deposit of those funds. And basically something to the essence of, something to the effect of holder to provide proof of deposit of earnest funds within X number of days. And basically you're going to calculate the number of days from, well, I'll get in that in a second. So basically, holder to provide proof of deposit of earnest money within X number of days from binding agreement date. Should holder not have received money and made deposit, holder to perform per, if you're in the GAR, per paragraph B5, and if you're binding under the RE forms, per standard terms paragraph 3. If the holder does not perform, does not send the notice that that the buyer did not timely remit the earnest money, then seller reserves right to terminate contract, to declare contract null and void under no penalty. So basically, you're sort of you want a copy of the deposit. You want proof of deposit. If you don't get proof of deposit, then you're asking the holder of the earnest money to do their job and send the proper notices. If the holder does not do their job and send the proper notices, then you want to preserve termination rights under no penalty for that seller. There's no earnest money there, but don't tie up the seller. We will check with an attorney and get some verbiage for you, and I will actually print that here below. So by the time you watch this, hopefully that will be printed there. But that's really what is important for you, and that would be a best business practice for you as an agent regarding handling of earnest money. Next best option is when you write the offer, have the earnest money in hand. Go meet your buyers in person, write the contract, answer their questions, go over everything right there in person, get the earnest money right then and there, or meet them the next day at a bank to get certified funds or to get money order or so forth and so on. But point of practice to you, do not send a copy of an earnest money check, certified funds, or anything if it is not in your possession and you are not in a place where you can turn those funds in to the holder as soon as practically possible. Now, whole nother issue if it is the closing attorney holding those earnest money funds. And I've done a whole nother video on that, and I will link that previous video below. So hopefully this helped y'all. Thank you so much for watching. Again, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.